January 1945. The forests near the German border are dark even at midday. Snow lies unevenly across broken branches and churned earth, crusted red where men have fallen. An Allied officer stands behind the splintered remains of a stone wall, binoculars pressed to his face, breath slow but unsteady in the frozen air. Somewhere beyond the trees, a rifle barrel is already trained on him. He does not hear the shot. No man ever does. There is only the impact of violent jerk of his hand, a flash of heat, and then nothing but ringing silence. For a moment, he thinks his arm is gone. He lowers it slowly, expecting blood, bone, ruin. Instead, he finds a crushed wedding band biting into swollen skin, warped inward like soft clay pressed by a thumb. The bullet is gone. Deflected. His hand is shaking now, and not from the cold. Around him, men shout. Scramble, pull him backward to safety. He does not speak. He only stares at the ring, the one thing he carried from home into a place where nothing else had survived intact. And as the gunfire resumes around him, a single impossibility settles into fact. He should be dead. But he isn't. And the reason is resting heavily on his finger, cold as steel and bent by war. By January of 1945, the Second World War had become a grinding machine with no mercy left inside it. The German Reich, once advancing with mechanized confidence across Europe, was now being crushed from two directions at once. In the West, Allied armies had pushed through France after the Normandy landings and were now fighting village to village through Belgium and into Germany itself. In the East, the Red Army was closing in on Berlin with unstoppable weight. Between these converging fronts, Germany was bleeding men faster than it could replace them, equipment faster than it could forge it, and territory faster than it could defend it. The Wehrmacht still fought, but it fought increasingly with desperation, with teenagers pulled from schools, aging veterans recalled from retirement, and officers commanding units that bore the names of once proud divisions that now existed only on faded paperwork. The war had passed the point where anyone spoke of victory. What remained was survival. And for the men at the front, the enemy was no longer some distant political idea. He was the man in the tree line, the unseen observer, the shadow that fired once and disappeared. Sniper warfare reached a savage refinement during these final months. German snipers were among the most feared soldiers on the battlefield, not because of their numbers, but because of their patience. They knew how to wait. They knew the rhythms of Allied movement. They learned that officers carried themselves differently walking upright when others crouched, pointing instead of signaling, pausing to observe rather than reacting. A single German sniper, properly concealed, could freeze an entire company into immobility. No shouting. No careless movement. No gathering in the open. The psychological weight was often heavier than the physical damage. Men spoke in whispers. Helmets stayed low. Cigarettes were buried in cupped hands. And officers paid the highest price of all. They were not merely targets. They were trophies. Allied command was well aware of this, but war does not allow for luxury. Officers could not lead from the rear. Not in fast-moving combat zones where a delayed decision meant unnecessary deaths. In the narrow roads and shattered towns of Western Europe, command meant presence. It meant standing at crossroads in the open, shouting over artillery fire, pointing through smoke. It meant showing your men you were still alive. And in doing so, painting a target on your own back. To the German sniper, an officer's insignia might as well have been a firing solution. By early 1945, the war had transformed forests and farmland into killing fields. The ground itself seemed to fight back. Mines lurked beneath the soil. Booby traps were wired into doorways. Houses that looked empty were often filled with death. And above all of it, unseen, came the crack of high-velocity rifle fire, clean, distant, final. Bullets travelled faster than the ear could process. A man could be standing in silence 1 second and bleeding in the next without ever knowing what found him. That was the environment where the incident occurred. Not on a grand battlefield with banners and explosions, but in a stretch of wrecked land whose name would never appear in schoolbooks. The officer had already survived more than most men would in a lifetime. Long nights on frozen ground. Days without hot food. Weeks without safety. He had learned to sleep through shellfire and wake instantly at the sound of sudden silence. He carried letters in his breast pocket, folded so many times they were almost fabric. He stopped fear the way all officers did by never revealing it. His wedding ring was not worn for sentiment alone. In war, such objects were anchors. A metal reminder that something existed beyond mud and death. Something worth surviving for. Weapons technology had reached a point of terrifying reliability. The German Mauser rifles used by snipers were masterpieces of precision engineering for their time, deadly at hundreds of meters, capable of punching through steel helmets and engine blocks alike. Bullets left the chamber at speeds that melted flesh before pain could register. They entered the body and did not politely exit. They tumbled, shattered, and exited wherever physics allowed. Survival after a direct hit often depended not on courage or strength but on angle, distance, and pure accident. No soldier stopped to consider such things when stepping into the open. War left no room for theoretical survival. You moved when ordered. You trusted your helmet. You trusted your instincts. And if a bullet found you, that was simply the end of one life among millions. But on that winter day, in that particular second, something else intervened. Something absurdly small. Something designed not to stop bullets, but to symbolize a promise made in peacetime. A thin band of metal not meant for war. And yet, in the violent arithmetic of the battlefield, it would perform an act no one could have predicted. Because as the officer raised his hand toward his face, as the sniper's crosshairs settled and his breath slowed, the war narrowed not to a nation, not to an army, but to a single finger. And in the world that would have existed if the bullet traveled another inch, this story would never be told. But it didn't. And so, now the story continues not with the physics of steel and lead, but with the reason that Ring was there at all. Long before the war decided his fate, before the uniform and the weapon and the responsibility of command, the officer had been an ordinary man living in an ordinary world. He had once stood on civilian ground, wearing a suit instead of a helmet, waiting for music to begin rather than artillery to fall. His wedding ring had been placed on his finger by a woman whose face existed only in photographs, now tucked into pockets and unpacked only when the nights grew too quiet. That band of metal had been bought in a piece that already felt imaginary by 1945, a time when the future meant children and work and Sundays without fear. War stripped many things from a man. It took comfort, routine, youth. But small objects remained. And for thousands of soldiers, rings carried the weight of whole lives in them. They were not jewelry in the traditional sense. They were coordinates. Proof that another version of existence still waited somewhere beyond the horizon of smoke. Marriage during wartime was not romance. It was defiance. Most weddings were rushed. Some were held in railway stations. Some beside hospital beds. Some with uniforms in place of suits and combat boots where polished shoes should have been. Couples did not pretend they were beginning ordinary lives. They made vows knowing those vows might be tested sooner rather than later. Rings were exchanged not as ornaments, but as armor of a different kind. Soldiers were buried with them. Prisoners clutched them in camps. Men kissed them quietly before sleeping in dugouts. Not as superstition, but as connection. France or Germany or Belgium might fade into blood-colored geography. But a ring did not. It remained a reminder that the man inside the uniform was not born a soldier. He had been reshaped into one. By the winter of 1945, the Allied advance was relentless. But it was not clean. The image of tanks rolling freely across Europe was a fiction created by distance. Every mile forward was paid for in bodies. Roads were taken only after fields were bled dry. Allied soldiers moved through bombed-out towns that still smelled like cooking fires and dead animals and old lives interrupted without warning. Civilians wandered ruins in dazed disbelief. Children searched rubble for anything useful. Elderly men stared at Allied vehicles with empty eyes. The war toward Germany's heart had become something slower than blitzkrieg. It had become erosion. And erosion is patient. Inside this collapsing world, officers functioned as nerve endings. They issued orders. They calmed panic. They chose when men moved and when they stayed still. But they were men too. And when they were alone, which they rarely admitted, they felt the full weight of what was happening around them. The noise never stopped. Even in moments of silence, ears rang with remembered explosions. Sleep came but never stayed. Minds replayed scenes they could not silence. This was not the war shown in newsreels. This was not flags on buildings and triumphant soundtracks. This was the war of rot. The war of waiting. And every waiting moment carried the knowledge that the next sound might be final. Weapons had become brutally efficient by this point in the conflict. The mechanism of killing had been industrialized. A single sniper rifle represented not just one man behind it, but an entire system. Factories, metalworks, calculations, test ranges, instructors. Every bullet fired came from a nation's will to destroy poured into brass and lead. Each trigger pull was an expression of policy made small enough to fit inside a finger. And yet, for all this engineering and intention, war remained incapable of total control. Men died unpredictably. Others survived impossibly. A shell would land between 2 feet and fail to explode. 1,000 rounds would scream past untouched skin. And sometimes, rarely logic would be openly defeated. Military doctors during the war spoke privately of angel wounds, injuries that should have been fatal but were not. Bullets that passed between vital organs by margins measured in millimeters. Shrapnel that lodged harmlessly where it should have collapsed lungs or stopped hearts. Helmets pierced but skulls left intact. No doctrine explained these outcomes. They simply recorded them. Fate, too, was part of warfare, even if it appeared nowhere in the manuals. And so when an officer was pulled backward from the firing line that day, alive and bleeding but breathing, the men around him did not cheer. They did not shout. They stared instead. They had seen too much to celebrate prematurely. They had lost too many to call survival anything but temporary. But something about this moment felt different. Not because the officer lived, but because of how. When his glove was removed, the injury should have been obvious. But it wasn't. There was no exit wound. No mangled bone. Only a swollen finger and a metal band twisted inward like bent wire. The ring itself had been crushed where the bullet struck. It bore a mark like a wound compressed deep into its curve. The skin beneath it had been bruised purple and black. But the bone had not shattered. Men leaned closer. Not in disbelief, but in silence. They recognized the mathematics of death when they saw it. And this did not add up. The officer said nothing at first. He only kept looking at his hand the way one looks at a stranger in the mirror after surgery. As if it did not belong to him anymore. As if it had become borrowed property. And in that moment, war did something it had not done in years. It paused. Just for the briefest fraction of time, amid all the certainty of violence and destruction, possibility returned. Because if something as small as a wedding ring could stand between a man and a bullet, then perhaps there were still things in this world more powerful than war. And from that quiet thought rises the next question, not about bullets or rifles, but about the men who fired them. And the ones who waited in their sights. The first angle is the human one, Because without it, war becomes a map and nothing more. The officer was not an abstract figure moving across a battlefield. He was a husband who had once worried about bills, about trains running late, about whether the rain would spoil a weekend. War did not erase that man. It buried him under layers of duty and exhaustion, but his inner life remained. When the bullet struck his ring instead of his flesh, it did more than save his hand. It returned him, in an instant, to everything he had almost lost. Survival is not only physical. It is psychological. To understand how close one comes to being erased makes the world suddenly vivid. After the medics finished examining his wound, he did not speak of courage or luck. He spoke of home. That was the instinctive reaction not to celebrate life, but to remember it. The ring on his finger had not simply absorbed force. It had collared his identity and yanked it back from disappearance. The second angle is tactical. German snipers, especially in the final year of the war, were no longer merely shooters. They were strategists operating alone. Highly trained men working with minimal support. Often positioned in trees, church towers, or ruined upper floors, they observed for hours before firing a single shot. They studied behavior. They noted patterns. And they did not waste ammunition. Their task was not to kill indiscriminately, it was to dismantle command structures. An officer's death caused confusion. Men hesitated. Orders delayed. Entire units moved poorly when leadership vanished. That was the real weapon. A sniper rifle was simply the instrument. The target was cohesion. When the officer lifted his hand that day, the sniper did not fire randomly. He had selected his moment, calculated motion, and pressed the trigger with purpose. To the sniper, the shot was meant to eliminate far more than one man. It was meant to destabilize everyone who followed him. The third angle is technological, and it is here that myth is stripped away from mechanics. Wedding rings do not stop bullets. They do not function as shields. What happened was not magic. It was physics at its edge. Bullets do not always travel in perfect lines after striking hardened surfaces. When they hit resistant material at imperfect angles, they deform. They fragment. They lose velocity. Sometimes, very rarely, they change direction. The officer's ring did not absorb the bullet's power like armor. It altered the conditions under which the bullet functioned. It changed the equation just enough to prevent catastrophic damage. Instead of entering flesh at a fatal trajectory, the bullet struck metal, distorted, and veered away. The energy transferred into the ring itself, compressing it inward, bruising bone, but failing to achieve lethal penetration. This was not design. It was accident refined to precision. That bent circle of metal became a battlefield artifact, more astonishing than any medal. Not because it was intended to protect, but because it never asked to. It absorbed violence without knowing it. It performed, without training or command, a function no human could replicate in that moment. In a war defined by machines, one of the oldest symbols of human civilization quietly interfered with modern physics. And then there is the enemy angle, the one seldom spoken aloud. Somewhere beyond the trees or ruins or broken wall, the sniper watched his shot land. He would have seen the officer fall back. He would have believed the mission complete. Snipers rarely confirmed kills. They observed results and moved on. That man returned to concealment, assuming the officer would not rise again. The war progressed. Another shot was taken elsewhere. Another life was erased. What the sniper never knew was that the target lived. And that ignorance, that silent miscalculation carried consequences no one could measure. Because survival changes men. And not always gently. The enemy never sees the full shape of his actions, and in that anonymity lies the strangest cruelty of this war. The German sniper that day was not a monster carved from propaganda. He was a soldier conscripted into a collapsing empire. By 1945, many German snipers were no longer elite volunteers. They were men drawn from shrinking manpower pools, trained quickly, and sent forward with the expectation that retreat would not come for them. Some believed in the Reich. Some did not. Most simply obeyed. Their role was one of isolation, silence, and waiting. They lived alone in ruins and forests and church spires. They did not advance with infantry. They did not celebrate with comrades. They saw life only through a narrow lens of glass. For them, war shrank to breathing and not breathing. One moving figure and then stillness. They did not know names. They did not know rings. They did not know what they destroyed. They simply aimed. They fired. And then they disappeared into silence. Then comes the emotional angle, the one that outlasted the war itself. Survival is not a reward. It is a burden wrapped in relief. When the officer returned from that position alive, he did not feel victorious. He felt dislocated, like a man who had stepped off a train before it derailed while everyone else aboard vanished behind him. He would go on to walk, to speak, to command. But something in him shifted. Death had reached for him and failed. That kind of near erasure changes how time feels. Each minute afterward no longer belonged properly to him. It became something borrowed. Men who survive impossibly often speak of this, though rarely in public. They move differently. Listen longer. Hold objects more carefully. Because once you have seen your end and stepped back from it, the world becomes sharper and quieter at the same time. The moral angle cannot be avoided. This war did not spare children. It did not spare women. It did not spare cities. Nothing carried immunity. Not flags. Not hospitals. Not churches. And yet here, in the midst of all that, was a moment of selective mercy so unreasonable that it felt wrong. One man was spared because a ring happened to sit where a bullet happened to strike at a particular angle. And somewhere else, at that exact same second, another man was not spared, perhaps because his boot had been worn thin, or because he had turned his head at the wrong instant. War pretends to function on strategies and maps, but in truth, it is governed by fractions of seconds and tiny accidents no general could ever command. Then comes the symbolic angle, the thing that history hesitates to speak aloud but always implies. The ring was not merely metal. It was continuity. It represented a world that existed before gunfire and would exist after it. It had been shaped by hands that knew nothing of trenches. Hands that worked in peace. It belonged to a tradition older than rifles and nations. A promise stronger than ideology. In war, symbols are often manufactured, flags raised, uniforms pressed, slogans printed. But this symbol was not designed to inspire. It simply endured. And in enduring, it defied the whole apparatus trying to crush human connection into obedience. The ring itself did not become a legend in official history. It would not be displayed in a museum with dramatic lighting. It was not part of an exhibition on battlefield equipment. But in the life of one man, and perhaps in the lives of those he would later lead, it became transformed. It was not an object anymore. It was proof. That survival is sometimes not earned. That love sometimes stands where armor fails. That something small can interfere with forces that consider themselves final. And so the war did what it always did, it kept moving. Orders were given. Men advanced. Bullets continued. But within that motion, one object had quietly changed the inner gravity of a human life. For the officer, the war would deepen after that day, not because it worsened, but because it gained another layer. He now carried not only weapons and instructions, but the knowledge that something unseen had chosen not to let him go. And that knowledge would follow him into the next instant, the next village, the next night of gunfire, until the war finally offered him something it had denied for years. A moment where survival was no longer temporary. The shot, did not announce itself. It never does. War does not allow warnings. It allows only outcomes. When the trigger was pulled and the bullet left the barrel, it crossed the space between two men in less time than a breath. The officer's hand was raised instinctively, not in defense, but in routine. A gesture as old as command itself. And within that fraction of a second, the future split cleanly into two directions. One where his body fell forward forever, and one where it did not. The bullet struck his ring first. Not his knuckle. Not his bone. The metal took the impact in full. There was no shattering explosion, only compression. The ring collapsed inward like soft clay under a hammer. Its smooth curve was crushed into a jagged crescent, and in doing so, it stole just enough of the bullet's certainty to change the war's intention. The lead deformed. Its path twisted. Instead of driving straight through flesh and bone, it skidded sideways, tearing skin and biting muscle, but failing to claim the hand, the artery, the life beyond it. Pain arrived late. For an instant, the brain did not believe what the eye saw. The officer stared at his hand as though it did not belong to him. It felt heavy, impossibly heavy, like someone else's arm had been tied to his body. And then sensation returned all at once. A flash of heat, unlike anything he had known. A pulse not synchronized with his heart. He dropped to one knee, not from force, but from confusion. Men shouted around him, but the sound reached him as if through water. Everything was muffled, slow, thick. Hands grabbed his shoulders and pulled him backward hard. His body resisted, not because he wanted to stay, but because balance had been stolen from him. Someone shouted his name once, then again, louder. A gloved hand clamped over his injured finger, as if pressure alone could persuade damage to reverse itself. Blood seeped between leather and wool. But it did not flood the ground. It did not flow the way a fatal wound would. It emerged hesitantly, as if unsure it was meant to exist. The officer did not scream. Not because he was brave, but because his breath had not yet caught up with what had happened. He was dragged behind stone and timber, away from the invisible crosshairs now searching for a new target. Boots scraped through half-frozen mud. Someone forced him down against a wall still warm from recent shelling. Another voice closer now ordered field dressings. The cloth was rough. The knot was too tight. But no one loosened it. Life was not given space to slip away easily in that place. Time lost its shape. It arrived in fragments. A helmet hitting the ground beside him. The sharp smell of cordite on the wind. The sound of another shot cracking elsewhere. The low, frightened breath of a medic who had seen too many hands not look like hands anymore. When the glove was removed, the men froze. One expected to see damage that could not be undone. A finger fractured beyond repair. Bones split through skin. A wound that demanded amputation. Instead, what lay beneath the blood was intact, bruised into darkness, swollen painfully, but still attached to a working hand, still connected to a living man. And then someone saw the ring, or what remained of it. It had not fallen away. It had not cracked in half. It had folded, collapsed into itself like an exhausted animal. Its once perfect curve now broken inward at a brutal angle. The mark of impact was unmistakable, a depression carved by violence. The officer stared at it. Not as a soldier, but as a man who had not expected to see tomorrow. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He simply looked at the reason his heart was still beating. And for the first time in years, the war did not feel inevitable. The medic worked quickly, but his eyes returned again and again to the officer's hand as if it contradicted everything he understood about war injuries. He had dressed wounds where hands had simply ceased to exist, reduced to fragments by less direct force than this. And yet here was a finger that had caught a bullet and refused to surrender. He cleaned the blood away slowly, part necessity, part disbelief. Underneath it all, the skin still carried warmth. The pulse in the finger remained present. Pain was a promise of survival, and the officer was now drowning in it. But nothing had been taken that could not heal. Someone finally cut the ring from his finger. It could not be removed normally. The metal had warped too tightly around swollen flesh. A small hand tool was brought in, its vibration humming softly against the silence that had fallen over the group. Men who only hours earlier had marched through mortar fire now stood motionless around a single ring. When it finally split, the sound was sharp and final, almost ceremonial. The band fell away into a gloved palm, no heavier than it had been before, but now carrying layers of meaning that would never leave it. The officer did not ask to keep it then. He simply closed his eyes, because the shaking had begun. Not in his hands, in his chest. The delayed understanding rolled in like a tide. A life nearly ended. A future nearly erased. All the unfinished things that had almost been wreckage. He exhaled once, hard, and that breath did not come back easily. His body reminded him of what had almost happened in the only language it still had left uncontrollable tremor. An evacuation jeep arrived 10 minutes later. In wartime, that meant luxury. A stretcher was modified from doors taken off a bombed farmhouse nearby. The officer was lifted gently for men who usually carried bodies with much less ceremony. He watched the ceiling of the sky as he was moved clouds perfectly indifferent overhead. War had never touched them. They drifted as they always had. Pale witnesses with no allegiance. As he was driven away from the front line, the world returned in noise. Engines. Shouting. Shells falling somewhere out of sight. The jeep hit a pothole and pain sang through his arm. But the worst had passed. He knew that in the brittle clarity that follows trauma. He was alive. The sentence introduced itself to his mind slowly, as if unsure it would be welcomed. Alive. At the field hospital, the doctors took longer than expected. Not because his wound was complex, but because it was disorderly. It did not obey the story injuries were supposed to tell. The officer lay still while they passed the crushed ring between them like an artifact from another war entirely. They observed the indentation where lead had bitten into gold or steel or silver. The exact metal no longer mattered. Its purpose had been replaced. What once symbolized unity had now been conscripted into mechanics. Unusual, one doctor finally murmured. In war, that was the closest thing to wonder. They cleaned the wound thoroughly. Stitched where skin had split under force. Wrapped the finger carefully, not as a broken thing but as something that had survived being tested beyond sensible limits. The ring was returned later that night. Placed gently into the officer's palm. It no longer fit. Never would again. That was when it became real. Not in the bullet. Not in the pain. But in the knowledge that the one object he had worn since peacetime could never return to its original shape because it had intercepted history. He slept that night. The kind of sleep only the nearly dead ever experience. Heavy. Final. It carried no dreams. Just absence. And when he awoke, the war was still there. But it was different. Not because it had changed. Because he had. The next morning, he was moved to a rear hospital. Most men carried off the front were not afforded this luxury for long. But when physicians examined his hand, when they studied the bruising and the path the bullet should have taken, removal from combat became unavoidable. The officer did not argue. Not because he wanted to leave, but because he finally understood. He had already been dismissed once. By fate. The war did not pause for his absence. It did not mark his survival with ceremony or record it in bold letters. Armies continued to advance whether he stood with them or not. By the time he reached the rear hospital, entire villages had changed hands again. Casualty lists grew long enough to feel abstract. The world had learned how to accept entire battalions vanishing into paper. But for the officer, the war narrowed to a room with clean sheets and a hand that no longer fit the life it had come from. Doctors told him what they could. The bullet had struck the ring at an oblique angle. The deformation of the metal had done what flesh alone could not, destabilized the round. It had forced it sideways, robbing it of penetration and redirecting its energy away from bone and artery. In blunt language, physics intervened. They nodded with professional calm. But their voices always softened when they mentioned the ring. Not because they were sentimental men, but because they knew statistics. They knew how unlikely such a trajectory was. They were trained not to believe in miracles. Recovery took weeks, not because the hand was destroyed, but because it had not been. The tissue was bruised deep, swollen beyond recognition. Movement returned slowly. The officer learned to flex his fingers again as if they belonged to another man. Pain arrived in waves when circulation reasserted itself. There were nights when he woke convinced the hand was on fire, and days when it felt as though it had been cast from ice. He was reassigned to a non-frontline role. The doctor called it precaution. The officer understood it as exile. Command, once taken, is not easily surrendered. And men who have led others into danger rarely embrace safety quietly. But something inside him had shifted. He did not argue because a small voice had begun asking questions louder than orders ever had. Questions about what he owed the men still fighting, and what he owed the woman whose ring had taken a bullet, meant for his bloodstream. He wrote letters now with greater care. Not longer. Just heavier. Each sentence carried a different gravity. No promises. No reassurances. Just truth. He told her what had happened in careful language. He did not use the word miracle. He did not romanticize it. He described the ring as he now held it bent and silent, and explained that it saved him in a way nothing else could have. He received her reply weeks later. It spoke of no ring. It spoke of time. Of rooms that still remembered him. Of meals eaten half-heartedly. Of the space beside her that did not forget his weight. War had stolen everything else from him. But not this. He was granted leave later that spring. Brief. Measured. Enough time to cross into the world where uniforms were worn only in photographs. Where footsteps did not echo with danger. Where the sound of a slammed door did not mean artillery. When he saw her again, he did not speak at first. Neither did she. There are moments that cannot survive language. He removed the ring from his pocket. Placed it in her hand. She closed her fingers around it without question. Not because she understood, but because she did not need to. He never wore it again. Not because he did not want to, but because it had changed purpose. It no longer symbolized belonging. It symbolized interruption, a decisive rupture, a moment when the future refused to collapse. The officer returned to duty after his leave, but not to the place he had come from. His role was now advisory. His voice carried weight, not because of rank, but because men sense when someone has stood on the edge and returned altered. They listen to him more carefully, not because he spoke loudly, but because his calm felt deeper. When the war finally ended, he stood among those who had not expected to see that day. And unlike many others, no part of him felt unfinished, because something had already brought him to a full stop once. After the surrender, silence swept across Europe like an unfamiliar weather pattern. Towns once raked by artillery now listened only to footsteps. Soldiers who had forgotten how quiet could feel now slept badly without noise. The officer remained in service briefly, assisting with occupation duties and transition operations, helping dismantle a war that once tried to dismantle him. He observed men younger than himself stranded inside peace, like refugees from violence. Some were eager to return home. Others did not know where home was anymore. And some, quietly, were afraid of a world that did not demand anything of them. The ring remained with him always. Not worn. Not displayed. Kept. There is a strange reverence that falls over objects that have interfered with mortality. They are no longer possessions. They are witnesses. He kept it in a small plain box, no inscription, no velvet lining, just metal inside wood. It did not belong to ceremony anymore. It belonged to memory. In later years, he spoke rarely about the incident. Not because it haunted him, but because people wanted to turn it into something else. A parable. A miracle. A headline. He resisted all of it. What mattered to him was not how improbable it was. What mattered was how intimate. The bullet had not struck his chest. It had struck the symbol of his private life. War, in its cruelty, had somehow managed to reach past the uniform and aim directly at his humanity. And it missed. Not entirely, but enough. After the war, many men refused to relive details. But he allowed himself one indulgence. He sometimes held the ring and imagined the moment without the uniform. Him as a civilian again. Passing time. Growing older normally. Not as a man spared, but as a man simply alive. He did not place importance on being chosen. The war had chosen nothing and no one. It had only taken, and sometimes failed. Years passed. Armies dissolved. Policies changed. The world pretended it had learned something. The officer grew older. His hands, once instruments of orders and weapons, became quiet tools. Of writing. Of holding. Of fixing small things. Occasionally, someone would notice the scar. They would ask. He would smile politely and deflect the conversation. Not because he did not want to remember, but because memory for him was not narrative. It was personal. The ring never went into a museum. It was never displayed behind glass with a placard explaining how fate bent that day, because its meaning could not survive fluorescent lighting. It required silence. The ring stayed with his family. Sometimes noticed. Never advertised. Over the years, a truth settled over it like dust. This thing had once been in the wrong place at the wrong time, which turned out to be the only right place. He lived a full life, not in defiance of death, but in quiet defiance of what the war tried to steal. He wrote letters. He kept promises. He lived simply. And when age finally took him, not in a field, not under fire, not in snow or mud, but in a proper bed with a hand held tightly inside another, the ring was still there, still bent, still recording something no medal ever could. It was placed among other small objects in a drawer. There was no ceremony, because it didn't need one. It had already performed its function long ago, and history never noticed. War teaches the world to measure life in numbers. Divisions lost. Cities leveled. Months endured. Body counts become currency, and the individual fades into statistics too large to feel. But sometimes, history stumbles upon a detail too small to ignore, not because it changes the outcome of nations, but because it reveals what war can never fully erase. A wedding ring is among the simplest objects a human being can own. No mechanism. No ambition. No violence designed into it. And yet, in one moment, it stood between flesh and fate. Not because it was meant to, but because human lives are not always governed by intention. Sometimes they are governed by proximity, by accident, by the silent, unexplained mercy of fractions of degrees and misshapen metal. The officer did not survive because he was important to history. History did not need him. He survived because something small interfered with something vast. Because metallurgy outpaced malice in a single second. And because war, for all its calculation, is never as powerful as it believes itself to be. It can design weapons. It can move armies. It can hollow out continents. But it cannot perfectly predict the path of one bullet or the weight of what waits behind it. That bent ring outlived the gun that tried to destroy its wearer. It outlived the war that gave it meaning. It carried no rank. It bore no emblem. And yet, it holds a story no monument could ever contain. It tells us that survival is not always heroic. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is unearned. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a small object, doing something it was never asked to do. And perhaps that is what endures beyond all wars. Not the strategies. Not the speeches. But the fragile, stubborn, human things that refuse to be erased.